Greetings to all of you. In this video, I'm going to do something a bit different from what I've done in the past, and I want to weave in more fully or explicitly some of my background in clinical psychology. I want to talk in this video about the issue of narcissism, pathological narcissism, and how we can see this playing out in certain individuals, but how we are also seeing it play out in the collective consciousness right now. And part of why I'm choosing to talk about this now is at the time of this upcoming new moon on April 17th, we are seeing, and it's been in an ongoing theme and will continue to be for a time, this group, this stellium of planets in the sign of Aries. And I believe it is in the age of Aries, the time in the Kali Yuga when we were at our lowest level of consciousness, that we got caught in this pattern of pathological narcissism, which is an out of balanced expression of the age of Aries. The energy of Aries at its archetypal root is about how do we experience a separate sense of self, to discover who we each are in our uniqueness, to then honor those fractal expressions of cosmic consciousness that only we can bring out in service to others, to bring it back into connection, into relationship, into community. Remember that every age has its sub-age that is related to the sign opposite. So the balance to the energy of Aries is the energy of Libra. How do we define our unique sense of self, but bring it into relationship in a balanced way? Libra. Unfortunately, in the age of Aries, we got out of balance with that. And I think that's a part of what's put us on a path of being caught in the patriarchal, destructive power over paradigms that are bringing us as humanity to the brink of our own destruction. And to heal, to move into the age of Aquarius, to move into higher consciousness, we need to face those wounds and heal and transform in order to move through this crisis time and transmute into new ways of being in our sense of self and in relationship with each other. And I think part of what we're seeing playing out in the collective consciousness right now are some of the most shadow aspects of those out of balanced paradigms of the age of Aries and the patriarchal power over paradigms, in part to mirror that back to us, to support us collectively in facing these out of balance patterns and choosing a path of healing and transformation. But let me step back a minute and talk more specifically and in depth about pathological narcissism. And when I say pathological narcissism, I'm not talking about the way in which we're all in some way on that spectrum of having narcissistic issues or wounds in terms of our sense of self or times of feeling inadequate or insecure. I'm talking about when it's really from a clinical perspective in a pathological range. And I speak to this from my background as a clinical psychologist. I've been a clinical psychologist for 40 years now. And after completing my 6-year PhD program in clinical psychology, I did 4 years of more intensive training in a psychoanalytic institute focused on the understanding of and clinical work with people with personality disorders, in particular, borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Unfortunately, sadly, even many in the psychological community feel like these disorders of the self are not treatable. And that just is not true. I've actually worked with many people who are borderline or narcissistic. I've seen profound healing happen. The person needs to want to heal, but we can heal from any trauma from the past if we're committed to being on a path of healing. But let me talk more in depth from my professional clinical background about the meaning of pathological narcissism. What we see in terms of narcissism is a strong sense of entitlement, often a grandiose sense of self, a need for external validation and affirmation. It's often someone who's got certain charismatic traits or seems larger than life or presents themselves as larger than life. But what's important to know from a clinical perspective, narcissistic personality disorder originates from early core wounds in the sense of self. This is in those early years of the development of the personality. We actually develop much of our personality and our core sense of self in those first few years of life and in the dynamics in our relationships with our parents. And to develop a secure, healthy sense of self, we need a parent or a caretaker who is able to see who we are, help mirror back or reflect back our feelings so that we can understand our feelings and experience, but feel held in compassion and feel held in being seen and loved for who we are in our wholeness, our strengths, and our vulnerabilities. Sadly, what happens when someone develops a narcissistic personality disorder is that early in their developmental experience, they've either had a parent who was also narcissistic and who was unable to see them as a child in who they uniquely are. And often that parent will need the child to be an extension of them or reflect back on them in positive ways. So rather than being able to support the child in the development of their own unique sense of self, the narcissistic parent doesn't see the child as separate from their own sense of self and needs the child to be in service to them. Another way it can develop is if there's a parent who's been traumatized and needs that child, that narcissist, that needs that young child to be totally focused on them, their feelings and needs. And again, there's a lack of empathic attunement, a lack of mirroring back to the child who they uniquely are, what their feelings and needs are, so that they can begin to internalize that to develop a clear and strong and secure sense of self. Sadly, this leads to a lack of a clear sense of self, an underlying feeling of inadequacy and insecurity, or an inner emptiness, because that child has never felt seen and heard and understood. So they don't have a clear sense of self or a sense of being worthwhile or even have the capacity to be in a clear relationship with themselves, to know their own feelings and needs. So it leads to this development of a false sense of self, the grandiosity or the need for external affirmation or validation in order to feel some sense of self-worth. And it becomes like an addiction. And many narcissists also have addictive behaviors, particularly sex addictions or other ways they're needing to accumulate power or wealth, again, in order to feel valuable, to feel that they have some sense of self-worth. But all of the time, but all the while, that's covering over an inner emptiness, a lack of a clear sense of self, and a deep, wounded experience of the self, and a lack of self-worth and feelings, underlying feelings of inadequacy and insecurity. And sadly, this leads not only to a lack of a secure, healthy sense of self, but an inability to develop healthy relationships. The narcissist lacks empathy, and because they haven't internalized that sense of their own self-worth or capacity to really honor their own feelings and needs and their own experiences of strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities, they have a lack of empathy and capacity to see others in who they are or to love them for who they are. So relationships become transactional and often become about how the other person can fill my needs as the narcissist to help me feel better or help me fill that inner sense of emptiness. So relationships then become about how that other person can support the narcissist's feelings and needs rather than being a genuine, mutual, loving relationship. And there is a need for competition, for conquest, for power over, for acquisition, for achieving success, for physical appearance, all these ways in our culture that is so caught up in social media and idealizing celebrities and people in positions of power, that can fuel the narcissistic pattern because we're also in a culture of narcissism. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another aspect of this, and I saw this often as a clinical psychologist, it was often people who were sensitive or empathic who'd get in relationship with a narcissist. And often their underlying issue was having grown up with a narcissistic parent and not feeling fully seen and heard and loved. But because of their sensitivity and their underlying empathic abilities, ending up trying to be the caretaker to the narcissistic parent with the hope that only if I love my parent enough, I can heal them and then they'll love me. So that child had to have experienced some sense of love and support from some other parent or caretaker to have developed that capacity to love and hold empathy. But there's still a way the dynamic is coming out of a woundedness and a compulsive need to heal the other. So then the empath feels and senses the underlying vulnerability, the underlying woundedness of the narcissist beneath the grandiose persona, and longs to heal the other with the sense that if I give enough, love enough, then that person will be able to love me and will be in this relationship that I know there's the potential for that to unfold. That becomes the dynamic that can be very wounding in relationship. And having lived that in my own life, I understand how wounding that can be and how easy it is as the empath to get caught in that illusion if only I care enough, love enough, give enough, then finally I'll get the potential of this real self in this person to be in relationship with me. And the reality is that, and this is a hard lesson to learn as a clinical psychologist, but probably one of the deepest issues I had to address in my own life was the way in which I had longed to heal the wounds in my mother and then transferred that into relationship and transferred that into being the best therapist that I could be. Because if only I can heal the others, then I can feel okay. So that was a big part of my healing journey. And for many of us who get caught in this dynamic in a relationship with a narcissist, part of our own healing journey is realizing we can't heal another. We can be a loving, healing presence, but only that person can heal if they are committed to their own healing journey. We can, as they say in the 12-step programs, you can care, but you can't carry. We can be a healing presence, but we can't ever heal the other. Part of what plays out also in relationship with a narcissist is not only the false persona, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the lack of empathy, but if a narcissistic person feels hurt or challenged or confronted or somehow criticized or something activates the underlying vulnerability, inner emptiness, or insecurity, the primary coping mechanisms, the primary defenses are distancing or devaluation. If you hurt me, I'll cut you out. And narcissists can cut somebody out of their life as if they no longer matter, as if they're dead. Cut you out. You no longer exist for me. Or they distance for a period of time emotionally or physically as a punishment and as a way of reacting to that narcissistic wound. But another frequent form of protection for the narcissist is to react in anger or rage or lash out at the person that has hurt them and to belittle them or criticize them or devalue them. And what the narcissist is doing in that way is taking all their own underlying feelings of insecurity or inadequacy that have gotten activated by that confrontation or that criticism or that comment, and they're trying to project it onto the other. And also, if they can blame them and devalue them, then it shores up this false sense of self and feeling of superiority so that they can feel better in themselves again. But it's very destructive. As I said earlier, having worked with narcissists, having done 4 years of intensive training in the healing and therapy with people with narcissistic traits or narcissistic personality disorder, the path of healing has to begin with the person wanting to heal. And often it's either a personal crisis or a crisis in relationship that might activate that sense of the person finally realizing these patterns and ways of coping aren't working and choosing to enter into a therapeutic or a healing process. And then the healing journey is about being in a therapeutic relationship where the therapist can hold space for that person in their ways of coping, but also honor the underlying vulnerability, hold empathic attunement for the underlying wounded sense of self. But also a key is for that therapist or healer to glimpse and see the true self and keep mirroring that back to the person. In other words, to heal those developmental wounds of not feeling seen, heard, or supported in who they uniquely are, in not feeling like the true self was seen and affirmed and supported. So it's in that context of safety and feeling the empathic attunement of the therapist or healer, the support for their real self, that the narcissist can begin to let go of the grandiosity, the false sense of self, let go of the armor, begin to drop into a more true sense of self, begin to hold with compassion their own underlying wounds and vulnerability, and develop more and more of a whole, secure sense of self. So those underlying wounds in the sense of self can be healed. And part of why I'm bringing this up is not only is this an endemic issue in terms of the wounds and sense of self that so many experience in our modern Western cultures, but it also is a collective issue. As Christopher Lasch wrote about in his book, The Culture of Narcissism, in 1979, and I remember reading that book as a graduate student and feeling profoundly impacted by it. And I agree with his assessment about how modern Western cultures really have this cultural problem of narcissism, but I don't fully agree with his assessment about how we got there. To me, understanding the precessional cycle, understanding these different ages and phases that we've been through, understanding our human evolution of consciousness and human history can guide us in understanding how did we get to this collective wound of narcissism. And I think it started around 3000 BCE. As I said earlier, I believe we got caught in that cultural expression of narcissism in the Age of Aries, and that it's an out of balanced expression of the Age of Aries that led to the patriarchal power over paradigms. Think about the underlying themes in the patriarchal period of the last 5,000 years. It's about a quest for power, control, superiority, conquest. It's about a drive, a drivenness to compete. It's about survival of the fittest, kill or be killed. It's about this underlying theme of a drive, a compulsive need for power and control and superiority that's coming, I believe, from underlying wounds. This movement into the patriarchal period and into these out of balanced paradigms of the Age of Aries actually started at the end of the Age of Taurus. Remember, as I said earlier, each age has its sub-age. So the second half of that 2,000-year period of the Age of Taurus, 4,000 BCE to 2,000 BCE, came at 3,000 BCE when we moved into the energy of Scorpio, the sign opposite Taurus. The themes of the Age of Taurus were about the honoring of the sacred feminine. Remember that Venus is the ruler of Taurus. It was about honoring the sacredness of the life on Earth. Taurus. Bulls and cows were seen as sacred. Taurus, the bull. But around 3000 BCE, there were a lot of earth changes, climate crisis, possible localized comet strikes. Whatever was unfolding, there were earth crises that led, particularly in the Mesopotamia area and in old Europe, to cultural collapse and destabilization of the communities. I think what got activated at that time with the earth changes and the crises that unfolded was a fear of death, Scorpio, and a sense somehow coming out of this honoring of the sacredness of the earth and life around us, that somehow the earth mother had betrayed us. And what you see around 3000 BCE are these increasing nomadic warrior groups coming in and destroying the goddess honoring cultures and further destabilizing the area of old Europe and the Mesopotamia area. This is a lot of the work of archaeologist Marija Gimbutas in her books Language of the Goddess, Civilization of the Goddess. She talks about this transition, and it's called the Kurgan hypothesis. What happened at that time and what we see historically is an increasing focus on and fear of death. This is when in ancient Egypt, they became obsessed with mummification. In more ancient Egyptian culture, there was no concept of death. They called death westing, that like the sun setting in the west to rise again in the east the next day, that we transition like the setting sun to rise again. So there was no fear of death that was seen as a natural transition, life, death, rebirth. But you come to the sub-age of Scorpio, around 3000 BCE, and suddenly the Egyptians are obsessed with mummification, with building these tombs, with how do we control death and manage the transition into the afterlife and rebirth to regain the body that has died. This is also when you see in certain ancient cultures the beginning of sacrifice to try to appease, particularly the sky gods. This is when human sacrifice started in some cultures, and lots of animal sacrifices, and a shift from an honoring of the sacredness of the earth to a transcendent sense of the sacred. How do we honor and appease the sky gods who may be punishing us or judging us? Doesn't this sound like the dynamic of a narcissistic child with a punitive, critical, controlling, narcissistic parent? How do I appease them? How do I be what they need me to be? How do I keep them from being angry or rageful so I feel safe? But again, it leads to this lack of sense of security, loss of clear sense of self, and a lack of sense of the safety of being embodied and being in a deep connection with the earth. As Chris Beisch has talked about in my interview with him and in his years of research of world religions, this is when we started into, particularly in the Age of Aries, the axial religions, the institutionalization of religions, world religions around the globe, that became, as he describes them, up and out religions. How do I honor the spiritual purity and security and immortality and perfection that's out there, But meanwhile, this earth plane is about immortality, is about suffering, is about pain. It is this way in which we got disconnected from the sacredness of the earth, the sacredness of our bodies, and the sacredness of all of life. If then you have this fear of death, and your religion becomes, how do I appease the gods, or how do I get to the afterlife, then it leads to a way in which we feel caught in trauma in this realm. And we're operating out of a fear of death and out of a trauma pattern that I think got triggered by the survival mentality, the fear of death, and the trauma that got activated around 3000 BCE with all those earth changes. It then led into this mentality of no longer living in community or cooperation. The earlier cultures of the age of Taurus, again, as Marija Gimbutas studied in her archaeological work, there were no signs of war. There were no signs of protecting the village or the community from potential danger outside. There was a strong sense of the sacredness of all of life and of living in community and in collaboration with each other. But once we got caught in fear of death and these external dangers that were coming to us from the earth changes or from comet strikes, then it led to a survival coping pattern of survival of the fittest. Kill or be killed, conquer or be conquered. How do I strengthen myself or feel powerful enough that I can fend off the external danger? This leads to an increasing sense of separate sense of self, fear of the other, this mentality of survival of the fittest, which is not the nature of plant or animal species. This is the nature of the human species post this traumatic period. And then we got caught in these paradigms of patriarchal power over, of war, of competition, of striving for power and control, to fend off the underlying fear, fear of death, fear of powerlessness, fear of vulnerability, fear of our mortality. It's fascinating to me to lead trips to Egypt, in part because it's a rare experience to be able to visit some of the ancient temple sites and see temples dating back as far as the age of Leo, when we were still at a higher level of consciousness. And then there are temples that were built or started in the age of Taurus. And then there are many that were built in the age of Aries. And it's amazing to me to see the different energies and expressions of these different temples. The oldest temples are built with such a profound understanding of sacred geometry, of connection to the energy ley lines, connection to the star energies. They emanate this energy of how we live at our highest level of consciousness when we are in balance and harmony with the energies of the earth and sky and all that is. That was the ancient understanding in ancient Egypt, that principle of Ma'at. How do we live in balance and harmony with all that is? And for the ancient Egyptians in those more advanced times, for them, earth changes, storms, crises were a reflection of our getting out of balance and a wake-up call, calling us to come back into harmony and balance with everything around us. But we in that time of crisis around 3000 BCE, instead of looking at the deeper issues, what are we needing to heal to come back into balance? We got caught in a trauma pattern and have been in a trauma pattern ever since. But going back to the temples in Egypt, you can see temples like the Temple of Dendera, the Hathor Temple, started in the age of Taurus, reflecting the energies of Hathor, the cow goddess, that are filled with these paintings about the cycles of life and our connection with the earth and sky and the great sacred feminine energies of creation, and are being held through our journey of life, death, rebirth. But then you come to the temples built during the Age of Aries, and one in particular that, from my perspective, is so reflective of the Age of Aries in its out of balance state and this energy of narcissism, is the Luxor Temple, filled with statues, monumental statues of Ramses II, the pharaoh who was determined to conquer enemies and be the superior leader, and creating these massive statues all over the land to be showing his grandiosity, his power, his superiority. He had multiple wives, hundreds of children, again, so emanating this narcissistic grandiosity and this need for power and control and superiority, and a lack of capacity to be empathic or foster a sense of community or collaboration with others. This is the paradigm that we got caught in the Age of Aries and the out of balanced expressions of the Age of Aries. And it is in the Age of Aries that we came to the lowest point in the Kali Yuga, the time of our forgetting of our lowest level of consciousness as humanity. And the sub-age of Aries is Libra. Had we worked that process consciously as humanity, we got caught in these out of balanced Aries paradigms, but the sub-age of the Age of Aries, which came around 1000 BCE, could have guided us in looking at how do we come back into relationship? How do we come back into balance? How do we heal this trauma from the past rather than coping with it in these destructive ways of coping and shoring up our fragile sense of self and creating more and more destructive dynamics in relationship with each other and in relationship with the earth and the resources around us. We didn't work those energies of Libra. We didn't heal from those out of balanced narcissistic paradigms, and they continued through the Age of Pisces and got institutionalized, so that the teachings of Buddha, Christ, and others trying to guide us to heal, to come back into balance, to come back to compassion, to come back to that awareness that we're held in the love of the cosmos. It is within us and all around us. We still didn't heal or work that, and instead took those teachings, institutionalized them, got caught in these religious systems that continued to be about power over and conquest. We are now coming out of the Kali Yuga as of March 2025. We are coming out of the Age of Pisces into the Age of Aquarius. It is time to heal and to transform, and to not only heal individually, to come into a clear, more whole sense of self, but it is time for us to heal collectively. And I do believe that part of what we're seeing in the world right now, mirrored back to us with these authoritarian leaders who are operating out of a wounded sense of self and therefore a compulsive, addictive need for power, control, affirmation, external validation, and who operate and make choices without caring about the consequences for their country long term or for the people around them or the people in their country. This is the destructive pattern that we need to heal being mirrored back to us. And if we don't bring that into conscious awareness collectively, then we are on a path of self-destruction as humanity. And the earth will go through a cataclysmic reset to guide us to wake up, to heal, to come back into balance. But we are so being supported by the energies of the earth and sky. As I talk about in a lot of my videos, I feel like it is so profound how the cosmos and the earth are trying to show us we are loved. We are at this transformational moment where we can heal and come back into balance and come back into harmony with all that is. But this is our karmic choice point. And as I was talking about in my interview with Natasha Kealoha, I think this Saturn, Neptune, we both feel like it is about a reset of this out of balanced age of Aries. Saturn conjunct Neptune at 0 degrees of Aries. And again, the Sabian meaning of that is a woman rises out of the sea and a seal rises up and embraces her. Can we reclaim the energies of the sacred feminine, come back into right relationship with each other and with the energies of the earth? The sacred feminine wisdom is all about right relationship. And that is what we need to heal, to come into the healing of the narcissistic wounds within the self and to heal the narcissistic wounds in our collective consciousness. How do we heal that collectively? We heal that by honoring our own individual healing journeys, because then we're emanating out that energy of healing and love and harmony into the morphogenic field of the collective consciousness. And we heal it collectively by not getting caught in our own fear about the turbulence of this time and the uncertainty of this time. When we get caught in our fear, then we can tend to give our power away to these authoritarian leaders who say, I have the power and control and I can make it all better. Then we're fueling that narcissistic dynamic. As I've talked about in earlier videos, when we get caught in these unhealthy patterns, whether it's the empath with the narcissist or someone caught in fear who gives their power away to an authoritarian leader, we play into the trauma triangle: perpetrator, victim, rescuer. The empath with the narcissist is, I'm trying to be the rescuer, the healer, the caretaker, to stop this negative behavior in this narcissist, because I know then they'll be loving and good and kind. But we're fueling it then. We're not stepping out of the trauma triangle. And if we get caught in fear and give our power away to an authoritarian leader who we think will make it all okay, we're caught in victim role and end up getting harmed because that person in that narcissistic authoritarian leadership role has no empathy or concern for the needs of the people. So the key is to come to center, to work our own healing journey, come to center so that we're emanating that healing energy into the morphogenic field and choosing to walk a path of integrity, truth, love, authenticity, higher consciousness, then we are activating that shift in the collective consciousness as well. And this is the critical choice point for us as humanity. And this stellium in Aries, in our tropical zodiac chart, comes from our tropical zodiac charts getting locked in time in the age of Aries, such that we see all this energy now as activating Aries energy. But as Natasha and I were talking about, you look at where this stellium is in the living sky. Where was that Saturn-Neptune conjunction on February 20th in the sky? In the stars of Pisces. We are being called to reclaim the lost lessons of the age of Pisces to support our healing. The lessons of the age of Pisces are we are held in the love of the cosmos. We are a part of the oneness of all that is. We are spirit beings having this human experience. There is nothing to fear. We can let go of the fear of death. We are in a cycle as soul selves of life, death, rebirth. We never die. We are infinite beings having this mortal experience. And when we can truly claim that and heal from the trauma of the past, heal the fear of death, heal that underlying sense of powerlessness and fear, then we can come back to center. We can open again to our awareness of the beauty and the sacredness of the life around us. We can come back into that openness to the love and wisdom of the cosmos that's holding us and guiding us and showing us that this is a moment in our human history unlike any other moment, that if we allow ourselves to heal, we have the opportunity to make an evolutionary leap into a whole new experience of being human that is about coming back into harmony and balance, becoming homo luminous ones, beings of light and love, coming back into connection with our galactic family, coming back into the realization that everything around us is conscious. We're a part of the oneness of all that is. Then we can manifest those paradigms of the Aquarian Age that are about truth, harmony, justice, community, collaboration, co-creation, being in that energy of Leo, opposite Aquarius. How do we find our own creative expression of self from a secure sense of self to bring that into community, to be collaborative together in co-creating a new world together? This is what we're capable of. But part of the challenge of this time is to heal individually, to heal these collective wounds of narcissism, to come back into balance, to come back into wholeness. May we each make that choice to be on a path of healing, to know that we're guided and held and loved, and through our experience of opening to the love and energies of the cosmos, we can heal. One other comment about this. I think part of what's fueled and perpetuated staying in these narcissistic patterns and narcissistic wounds of the sense of self is it becomes ancestral, it becomes generational. The trauma of the past gets passed on to the next generation. If a child is raised in a context where they don't develop a secure sense of self, then they can't parent their child and give them a secure sense of self. The wounds get carried on generation after generation. And one of the profound things in ancient cultures and in indigenous cultures today is that children are raised in the context of community. So if a parent is wounded, the child is actually raised by the extended family or the village, meaning there are others who can balance whatever trauma there may be with one of the parents to support the child in developing a more healthy, whole sense of self. But when we get caught in modern Western culture with these nuclear families often cut off from community or extended family, then we're just passing on these generational traumas from one generation to the next. Also, ancient cultures and indigenous cultures had this deep understanding of the rites of passage, and particularly the rite of passage at the time of adolescence. One of the things that I learned from my background in clinical psychology, and I was a clinical psychologist focused on trauma work, working intensively with individuals. I worked with children, I worked with families, I worked with adults, I worked inpatient, outpatient. I've had quite a range of experience. But one of the things that I realized is that those early developmental wounds tend to get re-triggered and reenacted in adolescence. And it's an opportunity to heal what was unresolved. But in our modern Western cultures, we don't honor any rite of passage with adolescence. And unfortunately, those wounds in the sense of self then can often get reinforced in the stress and challenges of adolescence, which are about the formation of another level of sense of identity. But in ancient and indigenous cultures where they honored that adolescent rite of passage, part of the theme of that rite of passage was honoring that letting go of the identity of childhood, being in the liminal time, the rite of passage, to open to a new sense of identity. And that adolescent rite of passage often involved a vision quest or a time where the adolescent would be in their own journey with that rite of passage of letting go of the childhood identity and attachment to the biological parents and coming into honoring a deeper connection with their earth mother, with their sky father, with their animal guides and spirit guides and helpers. To know that there is this other sense of family and love and support that's there for them, to be in them, to surround them, to guide them into a new sense of identity, which can then support the healing of whatever was inadequate in the biological parents, because now this adolescent is moving into their own relationship with the love and wisdom of the cosmos and their spirit guides and animal guides. When we, in this time of the age of Aries, cut off our sense of the sacredness of the earth, cut off our connection from the sacredness of the life around us and the consciousness of the plants and animals and our connection to the other realms, then it reinforced even more fully those narcissistic wounds, the sense of isolation, aloneness, helplessness, inner emptiness. So part of the healing also is not only to do our own deeper emotional healing work, but to do the spiritual healing of coming back into connection with our plant and animal allies, our spirit guides, our connection to the consciousness of the earth and sky, our connection to cosmic consciousness, to know that we are held and loved and can be healed by these energies much larger than ourselves. It's in my own journey and experience with animal guides and plant allies at the times of my darkest times of my life that brought me back into relationship with the love of the earth, the love of the cosmos that was holding me and guiding me and helping me through those dark times to be on a path of healing. May we individually and collectively be on a path of healing and transformation, to come back into right relationship with ourselves, with each other, with all of life. Blessings and love to all of you. Blessed be.